Will and turn it over to Will Heath. Let's bow for prayer. Thank you, Father, for this ministers' conference. I pray that you'll bless Will and anoint and use him. And thank you for what you have already done this morning through our executive council meeting. Thank you for the vision team and their wonderful report. Lord, help us now to be doers of it and not hearers only, because we know that it is of you. We do want to be a gospel-centered, gospel-driven network of churches. And I thank you for the vision team and their hard work, and thank you for Will and his hard work helping us. And now I pray you'll bless this time. Use Will, Lord, to inspire and help us as we consider the topic of secessionism, because it's something that all churches need to consider. And I think too often it's not even been on our radar. So I pray you'll bless him and bless us as we hear him. For we ask it in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
Will Heath was with Auxano, with Will Mancini for many years. And then he started his own ministry called Sherpa. And then he's written a book that comes out later this year, Embracing Successionism. I've already read a proof of it, and it's a very good book. Highly recommend it. So, Will, I'm going to turn over to you, brother, and you take it from here.
Awesome. Hey, thanks everyone. Greetings from the booming metropolis of Murphy, Texas. Does anyone know where Murphy, Texas is?
Sure.
Yeehaw.
Yes.
Go Texas.
Yes. I know where Heath, Texas is. Yes.
Yeah. Heath, Rockwall. I lie to people. I shouldn't say that on a pastor's conference. I lie to people sometimes and tell them my family's Heath, Texas, but that's not true. Our family actually settled, we were part of the families that settled Aubrey, Texas. If anybody knows where Aubrey is, beautiful horse country. But Murphy, Texas is near, just outside of Dallas. We're about 45 minutes north and east of Dallas. Anybody remember the old TV show Dallas?
Yep.
With J.R. Ewing?
Yep.
South Fork Ranch is literally on Murphy Road. Mm-hmm. And so whenever you would see the outdoor scenes, a lot of that was shot back in the day, which is about a mile away from where I currently live. Well, hey, in talking through this time, Ray was kind to ask me to hop on with y'all and just process. And hey, Ray, what do you want me to do? What would be helpful? And what we decided to do is walk through some research that I did. The topic of succession planning jumped onto my brain back in 2007. I was doing bivocational ministry. Currently, I am an interim pastor. I do bivocational interim ministry right now. This is my second church. I'm at First Baptist Church in Trenton, Texas, about 45 minutes north of me. We have about 100 people in the church. But back in 2007, I was a commercial banker doing bivocational ministry, and a dear friend of mine, pastor at First Baptist Church in Rowlett, Texas, Dr. Stephen Leatherwood, we would get together every once in a while and just have conversations. He was a mentor, a dear friend of mine. I had just read The 21 Laws of Leadership by John Maxwell. Is anybody familiar with that book? Has anybody read that book? 21 Laws of Leadership. I asked him a question, and it's pretty, we went to lunch. I bought the book for him. He hadn't read it. And when we sat down, I asked him two questions. The 21st law is the law of legacy. So I'm 30 something years old, in my early 30s. Stephen is more than double my age, and there's no topic off limits. We talked about everything. And so I asked him two questions. I said, hey, Steve, number one, what is it like for you to be a pastor when you are no longer the pastor? What does it look like for you to be a pastor when you are no longer the pastor? And then number two, I asked him, this is kind of my paraphrase of Ecclesiastes chapter 2, when Solomon is lamenting the fact that, hey, he built this thing and now he's got to turn it over to someone. I said, hey, Pastor Steve, what does it look like to keep your successor, whoever that eventually is, to really messing the ministry up? The church, Stephen was a chaplain of the football team, the fire department, the police department, very influential spiritual leader in the community of Rowlett, Texas. And And so those are my two questions. Hey, Steve, what does it look like for you to be a pastor when you are no longer the pastor? Massive question. And then number two, hey, Pastor Steve, what does it look like to keep your transition from disrupting the influence of the church in the community? As an early 30-something-year-old guy, I just thought I was asking a very passive, benign question. I did not expect the response, and it was like I hit a vein of emotion that was sitting just right under the surface of the skin. And for the next 2 hours, Brother Steve he just kind of emotionally vomited on me, and not in a bad way. But I in that moment, as a 30-year-old dude, like I think I was 31 at the time, I became the only person on planet Earth that Stephen could talk to about his eventual retirement. He was scared to death. He hadn't even talked to his wife about it. I was the only person. And what the Lord really impressed on me, a couple of things. One, I felt like God, walking away from that meeting, walked away. As I was walking away, I felt like God kind of tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, Will, I want you to help Steve. And oh, by the way, there's a lot of Steves out there. I want you to help. Now, I'm 30-something years old. Retirement was not, I hadn't even thought about retirement other than just checking a box to have some of my paycheck go to a 401k plan, right? That's all I'd ever thought about retirement. But it hit me, and it just grabbed my heart. So the other thing that I had this impression from God, hey, Will, I want you, there's a bunch of Steves out there. I want you to help. Number two, the first lesson that I observed about succession planning is that succession is personal long before it becomes tactical. It's a very personal journey. And that just confronted me squarely with Pastor Steve. So I'm doing banking. I go on a couple of years just on my own time researching succession. The position I had at the bank gave me a front row seat. I was the bank's liaison to the nonprofit community in and around Dallas. And so I met from 2007 to 2009, I met with literally hundreds of leaders in the nonprofit community in and around Dallas. And succession planning became this topic of conversation with almost all of them. And so I took a ton of notes. I just paid attention to this conversation and just seeing how leaders address the issue. And some of the organizations that I've met with, they were early in their transition planning. Some, it wasn't a topic at all. Many were pretty far into their transitions. Some nonprofits I met, and they were still recovering from poorly implemented transitions. And so it just became this petri dish of learning for me, just by God's grace and the timing of that. Well, in 2010 or fall of 2009, I decided to go back to seminary, or start seminary, not go back. And so I was working full time doing bivocational ministry. So that meant that I went to school when everybody in my family went to sleep. So I enrolled in Liberty University's online seminary program, and I took my first class. And I got to the end of that first semester, and I went to Allie, she's my wife, and I said, honey, like, I know seminary is something we've been saving money for, but I just can't get this succession thing off my brain. I said, would you be okay if we took the money that we saved up for me to go to seminary, because we're just going to pay cash for it, didn't want to go into debt for it. And if we took that money and I repurposed that, instead of going to seminary, if you'd be okay if I commissioned a research project on succession planning. So in 2010, fall of 2009, I actually commissioned the Barna Group to do a national session, and they interviewed 600 pastors on my behalf around the country. Got that report back in October of 2010. Well, fast forward a few years to actually the last summer, 2019. By that point, I've literally worked with hundreds of pastors and ministry leaders in the United States and around the world, just coaching, talking about transitions, helping them prepare for eventual transitions. And so I've learned a lot more about succession planning since 2010. So I felt like, hey, we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of that research. So I decided to actually recommission the Barna Group. So in 2019, we recreated that research project and we expanded on it. Okay, I've never released the information. You're one of the first groups that's actually will see some of these findings. I haven't written a book about it. I use it to help me understand how to serve my pastors. But what I wanted to do today, since Ray, when did we first talk? Do you remember?
Unmute myself. It was probably a year and a half ago.
Year and a half ago, yeah. And so when we talk, Ray is wanting to take a proactive stance in helping at the association, just proactively prepare for steward a season of transition. And so we started talking, but the genesis of our conversation was Ray wanting to just steward well his transition. And so that really led into all of this. But what I want to do today is just walk through that research. I want to show you some of the responses from 2010 and then 2019. What I'm going to do is compare, like I pulled out the Southern Baptist and the Baptist and Southern Baptist pastor responses. We're going to benchmark, say, hey, here's how everybody responded. And then we're going to say, hey, of the Southern Baptist and Southern Baptist pastors, we're going to look at how they responded. And I'm hoping as we go through this, a couple of things will happen. One, I'm hoping for those of you that are older, that I want this research to be an encouragement to you, not confrontational. I want to challenge you to be proactive in the way you prepare your churches and yourself for a season of transition. And the other thing is just the data. I want to encourage you, but I want the data also to be confrontational to you. There are some things that came out of the research that we have to address. Like transitions are too important to stick our head in the sand. And there are some things that the data very clearly is telling us that we have to pay attention to. So with that, I'm going to jump in. Ray, if you can, if you don't mind giving me control here, I can share the screen. Awesome. All right. All right, what do you see right now? I want to make sure I'm sharing the correct screen.
Yeah, we see the Sherpa succession planning research.
You see two screens or one? Do you see my presenter notes or do you see the actual slides?
We see the slide now.
The one slide?
The one that says Sherpa. All right, now I see two.
Now you see two. Okay, that's what I want to make sure. All right. And so here, so succession planning research, Sherpa is the name of my company. So what we're going to look at is the research for all that. We're going to compare Baptist and then Southern Baptist. What that means is we pulled out all Baptists, and then we also are looking at that subset of Baptists that is the Southern Baptist Convention pastors. Okay, so there are Baptists out there that are not Baptists, that are not Southern Baptists. You get the point. The other thing I want to be clear, when we interviewed the pastors, this back in last year, in 2010, we interviewed about 600 pastors. In 2019, last summer, we interviewed just over 500 pastors. So we've interviewed over 1,100 pastors in total over a 10-year period. It's about 50-50. About half of the pastors, right at 50%, half of the pastors surveyed in 2019 are planning thinking about an end of career transition. About half of the pastors are contemplating a mid-career transition. Okay, so it's about split. So the responses you're seeing are mid-career transitions and end of career transitions, about 50-50. Okay. 2010, what you see on the left there, that's just the front cover of the report that I got from the Barna Group in 2010. And in 2019, this was the cover of the report, just showing you what that looks like. A couple of things, motivations behind the research. I had one primary goal in 2010 was just to learn about succession. It was a big issue for me. 3 years after my conversation with Stephen, Pastor Stephen, I just couldn't shake this thing. And so Allie and I just decided to invest in it as part of my personal learning. And so instead of going to seminary, I invested in succession planning research. My goal, 2 goals going into 2019. Number one, I wanted to see how the responses had shifted. Was there a difference in the way pastors responded to these questions between 2010 and 2019? And then my second goal, when we expanded on it, I wanted to hear from pastors what they listed as their top concerns. I hear a lot of anecdotal information about pastors and denominational leaders talking about what is important to pastors. I just wanted to ask the pastors themselves, and so we can actually have some quantifiable evidence for how they respond. So a couple of things. One question we asked, you'll see at the top, you have in the yellow band, you have the timeline to transition. And then at the bottom, you see the gray footer that has, my copyright and my website over on the bottom right. But just above that in the red, the survey question, and the specific survey question we asked was, when do you anticipate transitioning out of your current role as pastor, whether in the near or distant future? Okay. When we surveyed all pastors, all this past time, all 500 or so, and then back in 2010, we surveyed even more. But this result is directly from 2019. All surveyed, this includes Methodists, Presbyterians, Baptists, Lutherans, all of those. 59% said they were transitioning 5 or more years out. 17% responded saying they're transitioning within the next 3 to 5 years, and then 23% said they were transitioning within the next 2 years. Now, so you look at that, of all pastors surveyed in the next 5 years, I want you to get your head around this. In the next 5 years, we are going to see 40% of our pastors around the country transition in the next 5 years, 40%. Now that's a combination of retirement-based transitions and mid-career transitions, but that is a significant amount of transition that we are facing, the church in North America is facing in the next 5 years. It's staggering to me. And now break out the data. So this is not all responses. This is just how Baptist, and you see Baptist, any Baptist, whether they're Converge or if whatever Baptist Missionary Alliance, whatever. And then we see Southern Baptist pastors specifically, 5 or plus years. All Baptists said, 75% said that they were transitioning in the next 5 years or more. Southern Baptist pastors, 78% would be 5 years or more out. In the next 3 to 5 years, 9% of any Baptist and 7% of Southern Baptist. And within the next 2 years, 16% of any Baptist and then 15% of Southern Baptist. Now you combine those two for all Baptists, 25% or 1/4 of the pastors of any Baptist pastors saying they're going to transition in the next 5 years. And then we see 22% of Southern Baptists. Now that's lagging behind. It's a higher percentage for all. So we're lagging behind what the percentage for all pastor responses were, which is a good thing, but still we're looking at 1/4 to 1/5 of our pastors in the Baptist world transitioning in the next 5 years. And 15% of Southern Baptist pastors transitioning within the next 2 years. Again, it's not as much as the all category, but it's still very significant. Another question we asked back in 2010 and 2019, and you see the question at the bottom, does your church currently have a transition or succession plan for when you eventually leave or retire? Or do you not have a plan in place? And so the little chart looking thing on the left, in 2010, 39% of the pastors said that yes, they have a plan in place. And then 61% said no. Now, between 2010 and 2019, the topic of succession planning expanded, like somewhere around 2016, this conversation really started to pick up. What do you think happened between churches that have a succession plan in place? Do you think the yes responses went up or down? What do you think? What do you think the response would be?
It probably went up.
Probably went up. The average age of pastors went up. there's more conversation about this going on. Here's what happened. It actually went down.
Wow.
With an aging population, we saw an overall 10% decrease in the number of pastors that said that they had a transition plan in place. And we saw an overall 7% increase of pastors that said they did not. And at the same 10-year period, the average age of pastors increased. And we know that based on the Barna research, the research that Barna has done for themselves. Now we look at just how Baptists responded to this. Baptist any, 23%, and then 24% of Southern Baptist pastors say that they have a plan in place, which means 77% of any Baptists and then 76% of Southern Baptist pastors said they didn't have a transition plan in place. Guys, we got 22% of Southern Baptist pastors say they're transitioning in the next 5 years, and 76% of those don't have plans in place. I mean, we're not being proactive in the way we address this topic. Then here's another question we asked. I got off screen there. Hit the wrong button. The next question we asked is, you see the survey question at the bottom. Regardless of whether your planning is done internally or externally, how would you rate your church's succession and transition planning? So in other words, regardless of whether or not you're a church that does the planning at the church level, or you're a church in a system that the succession planning is done at a regional or national level, how would you rate the overall quality? In 2010, 41% of pastors, the green there is above average. 41% of pastors said that they would have graded as above average. 49% said that responded as average. And then 10% said it was below average or poor. I combined below average and poor categories together, and I didn't give that breakout for the presentation. 2019, we go from 41% to 25%, or overall a 40% decrease in pastors responding, saying that their plans are above average. We go from 49% to 44%, or a 5% percentage point discount, or an overall 10% decrease in churches saying that their plans were average. And look at this, guys. 21% increase, or an overall 210% increase in the number of pastors responding, saying that their plans were below average or poor. I think what happened between 2010 and 2019 is that because more content was available, this conversation became more prominent. In 2013, Bill Hybels stands up at the Global Leadership Summit and says, hey, I'm thinking about my transition in the next 5 years. And because of the influence of Willow Creek at the time and the Global Leadership Summit, literally in 2013, everybody, just because Bill's announcements, like everybody had permission to talk about it. I think what happened is we didn't become more pessimistic about the overall quality of succession planning. I think what happened is we actually moved into a more realistic awareness of what it means to actually implement a healthy or quality succession plan. So I think it's a right sizing of response there. So when we look at Baptist any and then Southern Baptist specifically, 21 and 22% said that they graded above average. 43 and 36% graded it as average. In Southern Baptist pastors, look at this. 42% of our Southern Baptist pastors graded our transition and succession planning as below average or poor. 42%. That's one, when I got that statistic and I looked at that, that is pastors responding, and it's their opinions about how the overall quality in the way that they feel resourced to actually implement transitions. I think that is a massive, as an ordained Southern Baptist pastor, I'm an ordained Southern Baptist pastor. When I look at that statistic, guys, the bride of Christ is too valuable, it's too important to not be better. We have to do something different. We cannot keep approaching this topic the way that we have, and we cannot keep doing this to the bride of Christ. If we keep implementing below average or poor transitions, what is the impact that's going to have on our churches long term? Over the next 10 years. Over the next 5 years, guys, 22% of our pastors say they're going to transition. And if we keep implementing below average or poor transitions, what will the impact be on our churches?
Hey, Will, I don't know
Yep.
if you want to do it now, but it would probably be good now, but at some point, are you going to say in the next, 20, 30 minutes about, one reason guys don't even initiate anything is they don't want to be considered a lame duck.
Yeah.
Are you going to address that?
Yeah, I'll bring it up right now. Let me stop share here. So one of the things that, I tried to stop my share here. There we go. One of the things that I hear a lot as pastors say that they don't want to be proactive in the way that they plan for their transition is they don't want to become a lame duck, right? How many, raise your hand if you've ever heard that. Right. Now I'll ask you to be brave. Raise your hand if you've ever felt that way. Like, I don't want to say something. I don't want to become a lame duck. Right. Now, here's my question. Or here's my comment. Leaders do not become lame ducks when they take a proactive posture in preparing the organizations they lead for significant transitions. That's not why pastors become lame ducks. Pastors do not become lame ducks when they take a proactive stance to prepare the ministries they lead for significant transition. Pastors become lame ducks for two reasons, and it's not that one. Reason number one, the challenges facing the ministry exceed the capacity of the leader. The pastor doesn't have the skills, doesn't have the ability to address the challenges that the church is going through. And so the other leaders don't look to the pastor for guidance during that time. That does not mean that the pastor can't be effective, but that just means that the pastor doesn't have the ability themselves. And so in those cases, the way that a pastor demonstrates leadership is they lead the leaders to go get external help to address the problems that they're facing because they don't have the ability themselves. But when a pastor is leading a ministry that is facing challenges that exceed their ability to lead through it, and they refuse to get help, then the leaders around you will no longer look to the leader for advice. The second reason is you have a window of time. Let me draw this. Can you guys see the screen okay? Can you see this whiteboard?
Yes, we can.
If you can't see it good, put speaker view, and that way you'll have it all big.
So this represents a transition, right? So you have a leader here, and this line marks the point of transition, and then this is the successor. Okay, this is one way to a transition can take place. What I talk about, this principle of this transition window, this transition window extends. Okay, this transition window extends 3 to 4 years before a transition takes place, and then that window extends 2 to 3 years after the transition takes place. Okay, when you enter into the transition, you are in prime season to be communicating and acknowledging your transition. Here's what happens. Okay. Pastors, the timeline is moving, and because pastors, we don't really understand transition management, and the reason why I can say that with confidence is because 42% of our Southern Baptist pastors graded their transition planning as below average or poor. I can say with confidence that on the whole, as a denomination, we really don't know how to steward transitions well, and it's based on the pastor's responses, not me being mean and nasty, okay? But here's what's happening. Time is marching on, and you enter into that window. Everybody in the room knows we need to be talking about transition. We're in the window, but the leader, the pastor, doesn't say anything. As we get closer and closer to the time you need to transition, by the time we get here, it is too late for you to speak into the transition and set the tone for it. It's too late. once you go too far into this window without saying anything or setting the tone for how the transition will take place, you no longer become a reference point for how the transition will take place. You've become a lame duck. Pastors are not lame ducks when they take the lead over here and they start talking about and setting the tone for the transition. They don't become lame ducks. In fact, quite the opposite. Most pastors, at least most of my pastors I work with, when they are the ones that initiate the conversation, their value in the organization and their overall respect level goes up, not down. The people don't look at them like, hey, you're no longer relevant. They look at them and say, thank you for preparing us. It's the pastors that wait too long, don't say anything, that now everybody's no longer looking at you for advice. They're looking outside and beyond you for advice. That's when you become a lame duck. So this idea that just because you talk about your transition, you're going to become a lame duck, it's not true. It's just simply not true. That's one of those things that get said a lot that sound, it's a really good pithy statement, but when you actually start getting into it and you actually ask the questions like, okay, so you mean to tell me as a spiritual leader for our church, the way forward is for me to advocate my responsibility as leader to prepare the congregation. Like that's the posture we want to take. David tried that. Remember David and his oldest son, Absalom? Remember that? You remember David actually had another son try to declare himself king. Remember that story? He throws a party. He's getting ready to announce himself king. David at that point finally says, maybe I should engage in this conversation. You can read 1 Chronicles chapter 19 or 13. Start reading in 1 Chronicles 13. Go through 1 Chronicles 29. A lot of the capital campaign industry will use 1 Chronicles 29 to talk about, hey, raising money, right? You go to the leaders first. That's what David did. What I would say is that 1 Chronicles 29 is not actually a capital campaign passage. It's actually part of David's succession plan. You read verse 1 of 1 Chronicles 29, and it says, Solomon, whom the Lord alone has chosen to be my successor, is inexperienced. And so David used the capital campaign as a mechanism to establish his successor. That was just a component of a broader plan because David already had two sons that tried to usurp authority. And it wasn't until David actually stepped in and provided leadership in this topic that Israel was able to move forward. David was very close to becoming a lame duck, but he finally engaged in the conversation. You look at Moses. Numbers 27 and Deuteronomy chapter 3 is when Moses is confronted by God on Mount Pisgah to establish his successor. By the end of Deuteronomy chapter 3, the successor, Joshua, is the successor. How many chapters are there in Deuteronomy? How many chapters, pastors? 34. 34 chapters. The successor's in place by the end of Deuteronomy chapter 3. There are 36 chapters in the book of Numbers. The successor's in place and announced by the end of chapter 27. Numbers chapter 8, when God is giving Moses instruction for how to manage an aging Levite workforce. Numbers chapter 8, when a Levite becomes 50, they would retire, okay? But they don't disengage from ministry. The retirement to the Levites represents a shift of their influence, not an end to their contribution. They move from, at 50, they cease becoming responsible for the ministry. They become responsible to those who do the ministry. It's not an end of their influence. It's a reallocation of their effort. And so this idea that when older leaders take a proactive response in preparing the people for transition, the idea that you lose your influence because you take a proactive stance, I think that's a lie from Satan. I don't believe it. I think that is a cowardice response. I think that just has been parroted for so long, and I'm on a mission to destroy that idea. Your value goes up in the kingdom the older you get. It doesn't diminish. Right? I'm getting too preachy. Sorry, guys. Does anybody just want to respond to that? I mean, just not you, Ray. Does anybody is that landing on anybody? Is that challenging anyone? Does anybody disagree with me? Please, I'd love to hear one or two comments.
I could be wrong, but I think that's a new thought for a lot of guys.
Will, if I could just insert something here, I'm hearing what you're saying. I think all of us are, and you're challenging us. And it's like, okay, you know what? I see that, but in terms of succession planning, it's like, do we have to, like, the thing that freaks us out is the date. It's we say it's the date. It's predicting. It's forecasting.
Right.
That seems probably is a huge impediment for us, because if we introduce this to the church, it's the church. Okay, so when we want to know when. Well, I don't know when, but I know my age, and I know it's coming. It's coming, right. Really soon, sort of.
Yeah, Randy. That is a great question, and I think you're right. Which is why in 2019 I expanded on the research. But here's what I want to write to you. I want you to write this down. Succession does not equal search. Succession does not equal search. We too quickly equate succession planning with the search conversation, and we allow the search conversation to dominate the way that we think about succession. Okay. So I'm going to give you the research related to this here in a second, Randy, and share this. But I want you to dislodge those two things. Do not connect those two things. When we connect those two things, go back to the transition window, because we equate succession with search, pastors will move into the transition window, and I'm scared of that date conversation. But here's the deal. We've got to steward the entire window. The search conversation only takes place during this sliver of time. This is one of the reasons why past the transitions in Baptist churches go so poorly, is because we so equate the topic of succession with search, and we're not stewarding the entire window. We're preparing people to navigate that season. We're just managing a very small window of time. And by then, it's too late to address the other stuff. The search becomes the dominant topic, right? And we've gone too far into the window, right? The pastors advocated their voice this entire time. We go into the search process, and when you advocate your voice over here, what do you become? A lame duck. When you speak up here and you help your church understand how to steward the season, you're not a lame duck. But I think that's part of the problem. So Randy, here you guys wrote down, dislodge the idea that succession equals search. Okay, and here's how I'm going to prove that to you in a couple of minutes. All right. Let me jump back to the presentation here. All right. So you see the process pathway preference? Do you see that?
Yes, we do.
All right. So these are different ways that leaders transition. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. All pastors responded. You see the stop and go. The stop and go, what that illustrates is what I just showed you. The line to the left illustrates the incumbent pastor. The vertical line represents the point of transition. And then the line to the right under stop and go represents the successor starting. Okay. The intentional interim, the line to the left represents the incumbent pastor. That little dotted line guy there in the middle, that represents the transitional or interim pastor. And then the line to the right represents the successor, the permanent successor. And then in the overlap, the vertical line to the right represents the point at which the incumbent pastor steps out of their current role as senior pastor or staff pastor, whatever. And then the line to the left represents the point where the successor starts, and so there's an overlap period of time. Does everybody understand kind of the process flow there for each one of those? Okay. So here's how Baptists responded. The question was, which of the following processes do you feel would best facilitate your eventual transition? 19% of Baptists and 17% of Southern Baptists specifically said stop and go. 28 and 29% said the intentional interim. And then 53 and 54% said the overlap. Now, here's what I want to show you. This again is so confrontational. Randy or Ray, this is a feedback. This is data that denominational leaders, associational leaders must be confronted with if we're going to help our pastors. The only way as a denomination we resource pastors, Southern Baptist pastors, is in the area of the intentional interim. Guess 29% of pastors, when surveyed, said, yeah, the intentional interim would be the best way to facilitate my eventual transition. 71% of pastors, 71% have a preference for a different model. 54% of our pastors say, yeah, I would love to be able to do an overlap. You tell me where in our denomination I can go to get resources to help me with an overlap. It doesn't exist. The only model that we prop up for our pastors from a process pathway, okay, the only model is the intentional interim. 71% of our pastors have a preference for a different process pathway. I think as a denomination, we have to start answering some different questions. One of my pastor clients is a First Baptist Church in Durant, Oklahoma. Fantastic dude. When we went into his planning, he said, hey, I can be gone in 1 year, I can be gone in 3 years, kind of open-ended there. The primary process pathway that they wanted to follow was the overlap. We got into the planning process and we ended up shifting from an overlap to an intentional interim. Okay. We ended up implementing the intentional interim because of some very specific reasons, but we went into the plan thinking we would do an overlap. And what that did is it just gave them permission to think very differently about the transition, and it has gone fantastically. Okay. Now, my point is, a lot of pastors say they prefer an overlap, but once we get into the planning, the overlap isn't the way to go. But the fact that we could actually have a conversation about the overlap allowed Steve and his team to actually be able to engage in this conversation. Okay. Let me get back to the presentation here. Now, the next thing I'm going to do, this gets back to succession does not equal search. The next data point, this is where we'll stop. We'll stop after this. I gave 7 questions to pastors, or 6 questions. And I asked the pastors to respond as to which 2 questions represent their top 2 concerns. So 6 categories, 6 questions, which 2 represent your top concerns as a leader. Okay. So let me share my screen here again. All right. Of the questions listed below, which are the 2 that represent your greatest concern about your eventual transition? So here's the first question we offered. What can the church do to protect organizational continuity during a season of transition? In other words, what can we do to keep the pastoral transition from harming the church? We don't want the pastor's transition to be the thing that hurts the church. Okay, what can we do to protect organizational continuity? Number two, how would the church respond in the event of an unplanned emergency transition? Okay. Number three, what should the church be doing proactively to help you, the pastor and spouse, prepare for your next season? Number four, how will the church manage the process of hiring a new leader? That's the search process. Okay, it's one of the 6 questions we posed. Number five, how should the church best communicate with members before and during the transition? And then number 6, how will the church manage the actual transition process, or the nuts and bolts of the transition process? And then we added a 7th comment here to give them an out in case one of those 6, in case those 6 areas aren't the top concerns. And so we gave them the ability to say, hey, I'm not really concerned about any of these. All right. So what we did is we said, of these questions, we want you to pick your top 2 concerns. It doesn't mean that the other questions aren't important. It just meant that in the moment we did the survey, these were the top 2 concerns, okay? So what I'm going to do is we're going to compare all responses, and we're going to call out Baptist responses as well. So protecting organizational continuity. This question was listed as a top 2 concern 44% of the time for all pastors. But when we pull it out to look at Baptist, and then Southern Baptist specifically, for Southern Baptist pastors, 45% of the time, protecting organizational continuity was listed as a top 2 concern. This was the number 1 response. 45% of our pastors are deeply concerned that their transitions will cause harm to the church. And I think that's a beautiful thing. I think that is pastors that want to be involved in the planning in a proactive way. For some reason, those pastors are often seen as wanting to control the process. I don't see it that way at all. Most of the time, when I see pastors wanting to be involved in the planning process, it's not so they can handpick their successor. It's an expression of deep pastoral care, and they don't want their transition to do harm to the people. I believe that to my core. Now, there are some examples where pastors are very manipulative and do want to control, but that's not the majority of pastors, right? The majority of pastors care deeply that their transitions don't hurt the church. Emergency transition management. This is the proverbial, hey, what happens if we get hit by a bus kind of thing. Look at this. 42% of Southern Baptist pastors say this is a top 2 concern. This, by the way, was one of the first things we did with the Southside Baptist Network, is we created an emergency transition policy, and that was approved in May, I think, Ray, tell me, I think that was formally adopted in May, but we created an emergency and transition policy. Number 3, transition strategy management. This is, how do you manage the nuts and bolts of a transition process? This is, what process pathway do we do, the stop and go, the intentional interim, or the overlap? Which process pathway? And then how do we project manage the actual transition? What are the key areas we need to think about? Southern Baptist pastors, 25% listed this as a top 2 concern. You see all pastors listed it as a 32% listed it as a top 2 concern. Communicating transition effectively. 24% of all pastors listed this as a top 2 concern. Only 16% of Southern Baptist pastors responded to this as a top 2 concern. And I jokingly say that apparently Southern Baptist pastors don't care about communicating to their people in transition. I'm kidding, by the way. Next one, new leader hiring. Now get this. This is the search conversation. All pastors responded saying, only 16% of all pastors responded as this is a top 2 concern. It's number 5 on the list for all pastors. For Southern Baptist pastors, it's tied for 3rd. Now here's my point. We so equate search with succession, but it's 3rd on the list of the most important things to actually do to help steward this overall succession planning conversation. It's 3rd, it's tied for 3rd in top concern for pastors, and yet we treat it as though it's total, end up ignoring all of these other questions, which is why, again, I feel like we don't create a holistic process to help our pastors understand how to transition at the local church level. We put so much emphasis on the new leader hiring conversation or the search conversation, and we ignore the other conversations altogether, which is why I think we have such a poor attitude or poor perspective of how to do this well. Proactive exit planning. This is how do we help the transitioning pastor and their spouse prepare for their next season of influence. All pastors, 10% of the time. Southern Baptist church pastors responded 11%, said this was a top 2 concern. Okay. Now, the last question, I'm not really concerned about any of these. Out of all responses, it was 14% response. In talking to the Barna Group, when we set up this survey, they said that if this response comes in at more than 15%, then there's probably another big rock area that we missed. In other words, there's not 6 other areas. There's probably another area that is a top concern that we didn't name. So this came in at 14%. Look at this response. Southern Baptist Church pastors, 8% listed this as not being a top 2 concern. What does that tell us? It tells us very clearly these questions, these 6 areas: protecting organizational continuity, emergency transition management, transition strategy management, communicating transition effectively, doing the new leader hiring process, helping our pastors prepare for their next season of influence. Those are very clearly the big rock issues that we need to address to help churches steward that 7-year window. And if the only conversation we have and the only thing we think about is the conversation that comes in tied for third, then we're not stewarding a season well. Last thing in the presentation, sons of Issachar, men. You guys know this passage, the sons of Issachar, this description, sons of Issachar, men who understood the times with knowledge of what Israel should do. I think now more than anything, we are seeing the tsunami, the pastoral transitions is no longer this hypothetical thing that's sitting out on the distance waves. The waves are starting to crash our shores. The tsunami is real. We are seeing the largest we're on the front end of seeing the largest transfer of leadership in our country's history for pastors. It is happening. We are here. And what I would say is we need to be wise. We need to be like the men of Issachar who understand our times. We cannot, guys, 42%, that number blows me away. 42% of our pastors, Southern Baptist pastors, grade succession planning as below average or poor. And 71% of our pastors have a preferred way to navigate their transition other than an intentional interim. But we talk about and we model that all churches should be created equal. I'll just show this last thing. When you walk through, when you look at succession planning, the time to do the time to have the protecting organizational continuity conversation, I recommend churches have that organizational assessment conversation right here. I can have a succession planning related conversation. I can do an organizational assessment early on and never give a date. I do not have to have a transition date to do an organizational assessment, but I can do the assessment to prepare the church for when a date happens. I don't have to have a date in mind to do an emergency transition management policy. I don't have to have a date in mind, but I can create a policy that sets the church up should something happen. The transition strategy management conversation, I'm going to have that closer. I don't need to talk about timeline and date to prepare the people for a transition. back here. But as I get closer, within 2 to 3 years, probably need to start understanding how are we going to navigate. If I do a stop and go versus an overlap versus an intentional interim, that's going to impact the timeline, right? Once I understand now that I know what I've been working on, these big rock issues that we've been addressing to prepare the church, once I've got a plan, now I can start communicating transition effectively. I can actually start rolling out details when we have them, right? The proactive exit planning conversation. At some point before the transition, I think we need to have the conversation. Hey, Pastor, do you have enough money to retire if you're retiring? By the way, Pastor, the retirement conversation and funding your eventual retirement, this is not the time you want to start talking about whether or not you have enough money to retire. It's too late. We need to have that conversation way back over here. What can the church do to help you financially prepare for your transition? It is an awkward conversation to bring up. I get it. But we need to prepare. One of the number one reasons pastors delay the conversation is they don't have the money to retire. Just don't. And I get that. You're underpaid. I get that. Most churches want to do whatever they can. They may not be able to write you a big check, but they can begin doing something, right? And if you can start having this conversation related to your financial future earlier than later, then it gives opportunity to actually do something for you. Now, the other part of the proactive exit planning conversation, part of it is the financial reality. All right. The other piece of it is, hey, what am I going to do? What does this look like? Here's a crazy mind blower statistic, guys. You realize as a pastor, you don't have to leave your congregation. I cannot tell you how many pastors I talk to that want to stay at their church and be involved. Be involved in their church after their transition, but they're told they can't. And you tell me, how in the world can a pastor be a vital part of their community and a vital part of the church, in some cases for 2 or 3 decades, and then all of a sudden, at the day after they retire, they're persona non grata? That doesn't make any sense to me, guys, and it's not true. It's not true. I've got a lot of pastors that are on staff at their churches in retirement. I've got a lot of my pastors that are on the teaching team, serving in ministry. I've got a lot of those stories, guys. It is not true that you cannot be involved in your ministry after you have a retirement-based transition. That is not true. It's not true. And for every story of blow up you can give me, I can give you another story to match it and confront it with a beautiful story of how it's working out. Right? It's just, you don't have to be a lame duck by starting early. Stop equating succession with search. You've got 5 other conversations you need to have to steward the window. I don't have to give a timeline back here, but I can intentionally move into some conversations to help prepare the church. So prepare, think more broadly, right? You don't have to give a time. You don't have to become a lame duck. And number 3, I just want to tell you, you can still be a part of the ministry of your church on the other side of your retirement-based transition. Your retirement doesn't signal the day you have to be booted out of town. It does not have to be that way.
Right. Good
So
job.
what Randy's done is we've just taken a couple of these conversations, Randy, and working through the vision frame process. Working through the vision frame process is part of, for the network, for us preparing for Ray's eventual transition. What we're doing is we're codifying those things that we want to be true about the network, regardless of who the leader is. That's what that was. And so we have been this year in the protecting organizational continuity conversation, because we want to embed some things that are true about us, regardless of if Ray transitions in a year or in 3 years. There's no date. We don't have a date. But we're preparing. We have the emergency transition management conversation. We're preparing. as we get closer, we've got some things, we've had some outlines of some initial thoughts for the transition strategy management, the way we're going to manage the Ray's transition when it eventually happens, but there's no date, right? Ray is thinking about things that he can do on the other side of his transition when that happens. Just thinking about some things. What does ministry look like on the other side of his role here? And then communicating transition effectively. This is part of how we're rolling out the communication. So we're actually navigating all of these conversations this year with you at a certain level. All right, I'll shut up. Ray.
Thank you, brother. Yeah, our time is up. I wish it wasn't. Good stuff. I'll just, anybody have a burning question before we let Will go that you want to ask that you think is pertinent to everybody or most of us?
Yeah, I do. I've been at this church for 38 years. I'm 68. I have a staff of 3 other guys that have been here over 30 years, and we're all in our mid 60s, approaching 70. We just finished Refocus and Visioning, and we're about to launch that. In my mind and in my heart, I struggle with retirement because I love what I do. I don't, I don't really plan to retire in my thinking. I think back of a lot of pastors who continued well into their 70s and even beyond. So I find myself in a really weird position right now with the conversation. But although I've been thinking about it now for a couple of years, and we keep kicking it around with our staff. So really, where does that leave somebody like me?
Yeah. Man, that's a great question. One thing, this is not self-promotion, but the book that I wrote, this Embracing Pisgah, Moses, the mountain, right? Mount Nebo is where God took Moses to deal with transition, Numbers 27, Deuteronomy 3, but he specifically went to the mountaintop of Pisgah. And the book that's coming out is addressing that. It's a quick read, but it's 4 principles to deal with, honestly, the emotional side of transition. A lot of my pastors get hung up in their planning because of emotional stuff. And that's a real thing. That's not a sign of weakness. That is a real thing. So I would say, I would encourage you to make sure you're processing the emotions appropriately. The other thing is you're doing a lot of stuff for the church broadly. Maybe now, Pastor, is a time for you to engage in that transition strategy management conversation where you've been preparing the church. Maybe the angst in your heart is driven from a lack of specificity on how you're actually going to manage the process. And taking a look at that. And plus, I mean, you've got how many over the age of 60 in the 60s? How many of you total?
There are 4 of us total. And of course, this goes beyond just our pastoral team. We've got administrative assistants that have been here over 30 years. And so we're any day now we could all just drop dead, maybe.
I hope not. There's a lot of transition coming, and it's almost, I've seen this happen with churches that have a lot of transitions. It's almost like we've got so much transition about to happen that we become paralyzed and we don't know how to act. And so I think in this case, you might, and I'm responding to a very quick question, Pastor. I'm not trying to be overly simplistic here. Believe me, I know it's not this simple. But maybe you'd benefit from digging into some details and actually put some things on a whiteboard and start creating a timeline to give some real hooks to start planning towards, perhaps. There's other questions in the chat. Tommy Kennedy asked a question, interesting thoughts. I wonder if there are differences between larger churches and smaller churches in the succession planning. I'm so glad you asked that question, brother. In 2010, when we did the research, one of the biggest findings, and this was also true in 2019, there is no I thought succession planning was something done by bigger churches in urban settings with larger budgets and multiple staff. Not true. Their church size has nothing to do with whether or not a succession plan is in place. Has nothing to do with it. It's not a church size thing. And I want you, one of the popular books, and it's a great book, Next, okay? You need to understand Next, written is actually, the research was performed by Warren Bird. Warren Bird at the time worked for Leadership Network. Leadership Network exists today still to serve mega churches. When you read Next and the research done in Next, you are only reading research as it relates to the largest churches in America. The research that we did at Barna, we interviewed churches small and big. The research is across the board. Personally, the smallest church that I've worked with related to succession planning, going through these 6 conversations, was a church of 60 people. The largest church that I've worked with is one of the largest churches, is the largest church in its denomination with over 15,000 members. It's not a big church, small church thing. The way I process organizational continuity for a 100-member or less church is going to be very different than how I will process continuity for a mega church, right? But there's still continuity that needs to be established, okay? Whether I'm a small church or a big church, I still have to manage the transition process, but the way that I apply it is different based on church size. But the conversations and the need for the conversation is still important. But I want you to be careful about that. Read the book Next. I love the book Next. I've got actually, here's all the books on succession I would recommend you read, right? There's no shortage of books to read, okay? But when you read Next, you need to understand the research presented is only big churches.
Right.
It's not speaking to the small church audience.
Yeah. Hey, we need to cut it off. I'm afraid our time is gone, but thank you so much, Will. This has been outstanding. Thank you. Let me just close this in prayer, okay? Thank you, Lord, for this time with my brothers and sisters in Christ. Bless them, bless all the discussion, all the prayer that we're praying now about how to apply it in our various churches as well as our association. Thank you for Will. Bless him in his ministry, Lord, his new book, Embracing Succession, as well as his website, planningsuccession.com, that has such wonderful resources. Help us, Lord, to avail ourselves of those as you lead us and apply them. And thank you again for this time together. For we ask you this in Christ's name. Amen. Thank you. God bless you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for letting me be a part of your day.